What's up, everybody? My name is Jacob Hardison, and today we're going to talk about tuning with wheel hexes. Welcome back, everybody, to, of course, the lovely Adrenaline RC YouTube channel, where today we are going to talk about tuning with our different wheel hexes. Now, we have talked about tuning track width before. We've done that while we've talked about our front and rear pivots on our A and B block, and then our C and D block by moving them either in or out. But there are, in fact, more ways to change your track width other than changing the entire pivot point of your suspension. So today we're going to, as I've said a couple times now, talk about tuning with different wheel hex thicknesses. And effectively what it's going to be is a slightly more minor way to adjust your overall width. Of course, when you adjust at the pivot blocks, you're changing not only where the arms actually sit, but then you're actually changing your suspension geometry because your shocks, whether it be front or rear, will move in or out depending on where those pins are. So this is going to be a bit more of a, you're just looking for a little bit more one way or the other, whether it be more aggression or more stability, whatever it may be, depending on what surface you are driving on. So I've got a couple different hexes in front of me that range from, I think, like a 0 +1 up to like a +4. Not on all cars you're going to use all those. Traditionally, something like a +4 is going to be something you see more on a truggy, whereas, you know, those 0s, 1s, and even +2s, you know, you might see more on the buggy end of things. So to continue with our traditional Let's Talk series stuff, I will swap the camera around. That way we can actually show you the hexes. I'll get the camera moved in front of me, get the car moved out of the way, and we'll go over what the different options are in front of me, and then of course what each of those options are going to do tuning wise when you hit the track. So without further ado, let's swap around. Alrighty, so here we are swapped around with our hexes out here in front of us. I did go ahead and put them on their side from thinnest to thickest for the ones that I have here at the moment. Now there are different options even beyond this to where you can get really fine on your tuning, but these were just 4 options that I happen to have on hand. So you see we've got our super narrow guy here, not a lot of space between the pinhole and the edge, whereas obviously with this guy you can see that even though the pinhole is still close to the edge on the inside, we have a lot of thickness there on the outside. Now traditionally you'll see these more thicker ones, or more thick, I don't know if it'd be more thicker, more thick ones on truggy, and you'll see the more thin ones on buggy. Now that's not to say that those are necessarily exclusive to one or the other. You could very well, if you wanted to, put this hex on a buggy or put this hex on a truggy, but it's not something that you see nearly as often, I guess you could say. So first we'll talk about the front, then we'll talk about the rear. What you'll notice with this is a lot of these characteristics are going to be very similar to when we adjust our pin width at the hinge pin braces. So you'll have a little bit of repetitiveness, but this is going to be a much more minor tuning option. So if you're just looking for a little bit of more pointiness or a little bit more stability, then you would look at doing something like the hex. So on the front, let's say we have a super wide hex. So just for extremes, we'll say we have this hex on the front, the most wide hex. That is going to decrease your front grip. So you're going to have a bit more understeer, comparatively speaking. The steering response is going to be slower, and you're going to use it to avoid traction rolling. So times that you're going to see this wide hex on the front are going to be large sweeping tracks that are really bumpy, or even tracks that are really high grip, because that wider overall width will make the car feel more stable around the track. Now, if we go to the opposite end of the spectrum, we go super duper ultra narrow, as we see here on our left. We're going to increase the front grip, which means we're going to have less understeer, and it's going to be a faster steering response. Anytime you make the car more narrow, the suspension effectively becomes softer, which means you get more movement, which means you get more aggression. And as you go wider, the suspension effectively becomes stiffer. So you take away grip, you make the car less reactive. So the quick, just kind of recap, thicker is going to be on larger, sweeping, bumpier, or higher grip tracks to help numb the car out. Thinner is going to be more for indoor or for lower grip tracks where you're looking to make the car a little bit more pointy. Now, transitioning to the rear of the vehicle, we'll of course start with our wide hex first, just like we did on the front. With the wider hex in the rear, what you'll notice is that on your initial kind of turn into the turn, your first kind of 25 to 50% of the turn, this will be a bit more stable because the car is a little bit wider. So your into the turn will feel more stable, but coming out of the turn, what this is gonna do is it's going to make the rear end feel a bit more stiff. It's not gonna let the weight transfer to the rear nearly as freely. So what's gonna happen is when you rip on the throttle, you can potentially get a wishy-washy effect, especially if you're on a low grip track, because then you're taking away grip from the car on a surface that already doesn't have a lot of grip. So what you're gonna use this wide hex more for is gonna be like really high speed, high grip tracks, because it's not gonna allow the suspension to dump nearly as easy one way or the other. The other kind of extreme that you would use a wide hex would also be on a track that's like really blown out. Because of the bumps can potentially be very grabby, this wide hex taking away the rear grip will let the rear flow over them a little bit. Now, in some extreme cases like Silver State, where it's really bumpy and also low grip, you kind of have to find a balancing act where you get a little bit of the grip and a little bit of the flow. But generally speaking, this is gonna be used on high grip, high sweeping style tracks where you need the rear to be a little bit more stable, not so grabby, and flow around the track a little bit more. And then another thing that I did not mention just a touch before is that because it can't transfer weight nearly as much, it's going to make the front potentially feel a bit more pointy as well. Because you're taking away rear grip, the front is going to inevitably feel more grippy, comparatively speaking. So that is another thing to potentially look out for. Now, if we swap to the more narrow hex, what you'll notice with that is, especially coming out of the turns, it's going to allow the suspension to move a bit more freely. This narrow hex is generally going to create more grip in the rear, which then effectively means that your front feels less pointy. So this is going to be really good on low grip tracks, maybe not super choppy tracks, but definitely tracks where you need the car to generate a bit more natural grip on its own because the track isn't creating it for you. Now, the one thing to look out for with the narrow hex, just like how there's extremes on both sides, if you run too narrow of a hex on a really high grip or a high speed track, yes, in theory it adds grip, but if you're too narrow, what's gonna happen is it's going to dump the weight from side to side a bit too much, so then you effectively end up with a car that feels, again, a bit swippy swappy. So the narrow hex, you'll see more on lower grip surfaces, and the wide hex, you'll see more on higher grip surfaces, again, to adjust stability depending on what surface you are on. So I hope that this has been helpful for you guys. I appreciate you joining me today. I hope that you guys enjoyed today's video. Definitely, if you have any questions, leave those down in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to get back to you in a timely manner. But we'll see you guys in the next one.